Good afternoon. I would like to welcome you today to the Rockefeller Center during this 40th anniversary year. I'm Anna Mahoney, and I just joined the Rockefeller Center as the Executive Director this August. And I'm so thrilled to be a part of this team and support the incredible work they all do, including today's Perkins Bass Distinguished Lecture with Senator Judd Gregg. Named after longtime New Hampshire U.S. Congressman Perkins Bass, class of 1934, this appointment is meant to celebrate a New Hampshire citizen who has made an outstanding contribution in government, and Senator Gregg is an exemplar of this, having served his constituents in public service for over 30 years. During that time, he put his tremendous talents to work on fundamental pieces of legislation, including the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008, you may know that as TARP, the Deficit Reduction Act of 2005, and No Child Left Behind. As governor, his repertoire included environmental, economic, and educational advancements for New Hampshire, including significant support of Dartmouth. Not to mention his time in the U.S. House and his service on multiple corporate boards. We are also grateful that Senator Gregg's wife, Kathleen McClellan Gregg, is joining us for this evening's program. Welcome, Kathy. Today, Senator Gregg will be joined in conversation by my colleague, Professor Kristin Smith, whose research focuses on gender inequality, earnings and employment, and work and family policy. As you can see, their shared interest in economic policy ensures a dynamic and informative afternoon for all of us. Professor Smith also directs our policy research shop here at Rocky, which gives students an opportunity to contribute directly to our Vermont and New Hampshire communities through policy brief writing. Professor Smith is sincerely engaged in the work of preparing Dartmouth students to lead, and there's no one better to join Senator Gregg in conversation about the health of our democracy. Remember, our live stream audience can ask questions by emailing rockyqa@dartmouth.edu. So we will begin with Senator Gregg, and then Professor Smith will moderate the Q&A. Please join me in welcoming Senator Gregg.
Thank you, Ann. It's a pleasure for Kathy and I to be here. We love coming to Dartmouth. We sent 3 children here, and now we can come here and not send any money. It's a pretty good deal. We both knew Perkins Bass very well because we raised our children in Greenfield, New Hampshire, which is right beside Peterborough, which was the Bass Power Center. And we especially knew Charlie Bass, his son, who was also a Dartmouth graduate and who succeeded me in Congress. And we have a lot of favorite Charlie Bass stories, which I tie to Perkins because he was Perkins' son. But when we first ran for Congress, the race involved myself, and Kathy was obviously there doing all the work, Charlie Bass, who was Perkins' son, but also the son of the former Governor Robert Bass, and Susan McLean, whose stepfather had been governor of New Hampshire, and whose daughter is now the congresswoman from the 2nd District. So it was a pretty interesting race. And Susan, Kathy tells me she wasn't a triplet, but I'm pretty sure she was a triplet. Because Charlie and I would go to these parades, and then we'd hear, and Susan would be in the parade, and then we'd hear that Susan, this parade might be in Hollis, and then we'd hear that Susan was doing a parade in Goffstown, and she was also doing a parade in Hanover, and maybe a parade somewhere up north, like Laconia. And Charlie and I would shake our heads and we say, how does she manage to get to those places? Turns out her sisters were marching on all the parades. And Charlie had this great little jingle. And our daughter was like 2 years old, 2.5. And so Kathy's driving our daughter to kindergarten in the morning in the middle of the campaign, and from the back seat, this jingle goes, Charlie Bass, one of our best, one of our own. It was a tough campaign. But they've been an immense force, the Bass family, in what is positive about New Hampshire over the years. And I'm really happy to be able to be at a seminar or symposium that's named for him. The title of the discussion was, is Senate broken? The better question would be, is American governance broken at the federal level, obviously? And the answer is complex, I think, but it's something that I want to get into a few subtleties first. See, when I was first elected, and especially to the Senate, there was an atmosphere of collegiality which dominated the Senate. Kathy and I would go to games with our kids, and Al Gore or Ted Kennedy would be at the same game with their kids. We'd go on gatherings that involved joint discussions. And there was a desire to reach agreement. That doesn't mean that there wasn't partisanship. Partisanship has always been a huge element of American politics. And in fact, of course, you've over the years had really confrontational partisanship. I mean, just at the end of the term of George Washington, people wanted to get rid of him because they thought he wanted to be king. If you read about Abraham Lincoln and the intense vitriol that was directed at him during his term, or some of our two greatest presidents probably, were involved in massive partisanship. So partisanship is not unique, but the difference when we were there, I think, was that there was also a goal to govern. And I would take No Child Left Behind, which was mentioned as an example of that. That bill, which when George W. Bush was elected president, he just wanted to be a domestic, his focus was on domestic policy. And it wasn't 9/11, of course, totally disrupted that, and he became a wartime president. But for the first part of his term, he was focused totally on domestic policy. And one of the things he was very concerned about, and we were all concerned about, was the level of education and the failure of education at the elementary and secondary school level and further up, but specifically in that area. And so he called together the leadership of the committees that had responsibility for this before he was inaugurated. He had us all come down to Texas and meet. And there was a lot of cynicism, I think, or concern from the other side of the aisle that this wasn't a good idea, but Senator Kennedy rose above that and said, okay, we're gonna give you the benefit of the doubt. And what happened was that for the next 4.5 months, Senator Kennedy, myself, John Boehner, who wasn't Speaker of the House at the time, but was Chairman of the House Education Committee, and George Miller, who was the ranking Democrat on the House Education Committee, we met every week, sometimes twice a week, upstairs, sometimes joined by Jim Jeffords, upstairs in the Kennedy's private office in the Capitol, and we negotiated. It was intense. The disagreements were intense. Ted Kennedy was the lion of the liberal movement in this country. He defined liberalism in this country, and basically what he said went. And he had strong views, and he spoke very loudly. In fact, when I was chairman of the committee and he was my ranking member, I would turn off his microphones because I said he was giving me a headache. But we would meet for hours on end to hammer out what we thought could help, where the federal government could help in elementary and secondary education. And we reached an agreement. And the agreement was reached because we were all pretty ideological in that room. I was a conservative, certainly Boehner was a conservative. George Miller was very much a liberal, and Ted Kennedy, of course. But we were all there to do one thing. We were there to govern. We knew if we were going to govern, we were going to have to reach an agreement, even though we might have to step on a few toes of our own folks in the process. And we reached this agreement. And it was such a good agreement that it was opposed by the hard right and the hard left. I mean, that showed it was a perfect agreement. That regrettably, that atmosphere is breaking down. And I think it's breaking down for basically 4 reasons, but there's another reason I'll get into in a second. First is gerrymandering in the House. 60 to 65% of the House seats now are single-party seats. In other words, you run in the primary, you win in that district. If that's a Republican district, you're the congressperson. Democratic district, you're the congressperson. That means primaries, who votes in primaries? Well, usually the most enthusiastic, sincere, and hard-over members of your party. The majority vote. And what do they not tolerate? that part of your party. They don't tolerate compromise. They have very strong views. They want you to carry those views to Washington. So those folks from those 60 to 65% of the districts, they can't cross the aisle. If they cross the aisle, they immediately get challenged from their base by somebody in that next primary. And you've seen this happen over and over again. In fact, there were two Democratic members in Pennsylvania just 4 years ago who lost their seats because they had attempted a compromise. And you see it on our side of the aisle too. So gerrymandering has forced the House specifically into somewhat of a standstill, so to say, in the area of reaching agreements that cause compromise and cause governance. And remember, when Madison created our government, he was most concerned about autocracy. We'd been governed by the autocratic government in England, and he didn't want that repeated here. So what he set up specifically was a system to force compromise. And that was the whole concept of the separation of powers. He took it from Governor Randolph, of course, but he never gave Governor Randolph credit. But basically, that was the idea. You force, through the systematic effort of bringing people together, an agreement rather than having it a top-down autocratic decision. And that is Madisonian government. Well, that's being lost, of course, in the House of Representatives through gerrymandering. The second thing that's causing this problem with our form of government right now, or the way our government is working or not working, is what I call virulent populism. Now, we've always had a very strong populist movement in this country. It's always been there. It's always been part of both parties. Sometimes it's been outside the parties. Andrew Jackson was the first populist president. You could argue that Donald Trump was the second populist president. But there's always been this movement, but it has never dominated, rarely ever dominated the political discussion to the point where it was the primary force. Now you see it both on the left and the right as the dominant force. And why is that? Well, it's social media. Social media has essentially changed the way the dialogue of American politics works. It used to be when I was first elected, and Kathy and I would go to town meetings, which we did a lot of, that there would be, after the town meeting, a group of 5 people over here who were members of the SDS, or former members, and there'd be 5 people over here who were members of the John Birch Society, and they would get together and they'd talk, and they'd be outraged. But that's the only way they could gather, was to show up at my town meeting, or our town meeting, and that's where they would meet. Today, social media has created a disproportionate megaphone for the fringe elements within our political dialogue. And more importantly than that, it has allowed those fringe elements to drown out rational discussion of complex issues. Now, there are absolutely no issues which the federal government addresses, which are important, that are not complex. There are no simple answers to any of these things. And so if you drown out thoughtful discussion in the middle, you can't possibly reach agreement in the end on compromise. And so this virulent populism, coupled with social media, has essentially forced out of the discussion the ability and the necessary exchanges which will lead to bring people together rather than to drive them apart, which is what our system requires under the Madisonian form of government. The fourth area that has happened is the political parties have collapsed. The purpose of the political parties, and the reason why we have 2 parties in this country, and it's very important that we only have 2 parties, is the first step towards compromise. Gathering people under large tents so they have to get to an agreement within their party as to what they stand for, and it works up, slowly filters up until they have a position, and then the other party has a position, and then you collide and try to figure out how those 2 positions on big issues can be resolved. You look at the European party system, it's stovepiped. Everybody goes to their party, which agrees with them, you know, whatever it happens to be. I'm for rabbits over here, or I'm for squirrels over here. And you don't leave that stovepipe, and you don't talk to anybody in the other. And that's why so many of the governments in Europe just are purely dysfunctional. But our system, again, because of Madison, although he didn't believe in parties, certainly Washington didn't believe in parties, our system has evolved the system of bringing initially people together through the political party process. But our political parties have now become stratified to the point where even within the parties, there's no capacity to reach consensus on very important issues. And You could argue that they're no longer parties, they're almost cults, cults of certain figures or cults of certain viewpoints. And that doesn't work in a system that cults don't compromise, so that it just doesn't work. So that's why I think we have this problem. Then there's one other big issue that is changing American governance, and that's the rise of the regulatory state. Because the Congress has been incapable of basically governing, and because it basically has ceded the ground of governance, that vacuum has been filled by unelected people who regulate. And they have taken on basically the role of governance, but they respond to virtually no one. Now, granted, they respond to the president, theoretically, but really they don't. Over time, they become totally independent, even of the presidency. And you're seeing that again and again. You saw it under Trump, you're seeing it under Biden, where essentially government has been handed over to regulators who are not responsive to any elected official. The only thing that stands between the regulator and the American people today in the area of accountability is the court system. It should be the Congress. It's not the Congress. The Congress should have the capacity to basically discipline the regulators either through appropriations or through hearings or through legislation, but they don't pass appropriations bills of any meaning, and they don't know how to discipline through legislation. So that has created an entirely different situation as to the way we are governing. So we have these huge issues today that we as a government really need to face up to. I was asked this at the class earlier, Professor Smith's class. What do you think the biggest issues are? Well, number one, for students here at Dartmouth and for the future of the students here at Dartmouth, is the fiscal issue. We now have $33 trillion of debt. That's a staggering amount of debt. And if you take it and you put it into a context of what it means relative to other countries, our debt is now about 110% of GDP. Well, we thought Greece was a basket case when they had 100% of GDP as their debt. And it's going to be 180% of GDP by the end of this decade. We're talking about a $2 trillion deficit this year, $2 trillion. When I left the Congress, the largest deficit we'd ever had was $4 billion. And our average deficit was $250 billion. That's not that long ago. When Barack Obama was sworn in, the national debt was $8 trillion. The debt to GDP ratio was 70%. This pathway is going to lead to a serious fiscal issue for us as a country that is going to translate into a very significant reduction in standard of living for the next generation. And why is that? Because at some point, people are going to wake up around this world, and they're going to say, the people who are lending us this money, whether it happens to be Japan or China or the Arab Emirates, and they're going to say, hold it. The United States cannot possibly pay back the money I've lent them with a dollar that's worth as much as I gave them. And they will anticipate a reduction in the value of the dollar, a dollar crisis driven primarily by inflation, of course, which we're seeing now, but this isn't inflation caused by a dollar crisis, it's inflation caused by something else. It's caused by the COVID situation. But when that happens, when the world wakes up and decides, or the money centers of the world, or the people who lend us the money wake up and say, I'm sorry, we're not going to lend you this money anymore unless you give us a much higher rate of return to justify the fact that the dollar's not going to be worth as much as when I give it to you, then you have a dollar crisis. And what does that lead to? It leads to massive inflation in the economy. It leads to a dramatic drop in the standard of living of all Americans. Biggest tax we could possibly have. That issue has to be addressed. Second issue, in my opinion, that's really huge for our future as a country is how we deal with China. I mean, this is a country that has 1 billion more people than we have. 1 billion more people. They're as productive and as aggressive as we are. They're creative, and they want to have a role. They have a role. They want to be the largest economy in the world. They tend to be the largest economy in the world. I don't know that they're going to get there as soon as they thought they were, because they've got serious economic issues right now. But the fact is there's a need for us to engage in them in a way that doesn't lead to a military tension or military event. And yet today you're hearing a lot more talk on both sides, in China and here about the use of a military solution here, that would be a disaster. You don't go to war with a country that has 1 billion more people than you have. And if you do go to war with that type of country, the weapons you'd have to use would be catastrophic to the world population. So we have to have a more rational approach to China. But how do we do that without having a discussion, a public discussion that isn't jingoizing this issue? Is that a word, jingoizing? Good. Yeah, got a new word, jingoizing that issue. Well, you can't do it unless you can create form in the electives arena that allows that to happen, and it's not being allowed to happen as a result of the reasons I outlined. So beyond this greatly depressing proposals, talk I've just given you, let me give you a little breath of fresh air. The Senate is the one place where this can be resolved. The Senate was designed to be the saucer into which the hot coffee is poured. That was the classic line from George Washington. And it's still got that capacity. The Senate has a functioning center. People on both sides of the aisle who are there to govern and who know how to go across the aisle. You just saw it in their agreement on the continuing resolution, which just came out. More importantly, you saw it on their dress code agreement, which they just passed a couple days ago. Very important. But what you're seeing is that the Senate does have the capacity to work on big problems and reach solutions which can work. And in my opinion, all of this, whether it's the Senate, whether it's the House, whether it's the presidency, whether it's our cultural one, it comes really down to one thing: leadership. Individuals make the difference. If there's anything, well, hopefully I learned a lot of things after 32 years in government. But one of the black letter rule things I learned is there's no invisible hand out there running this country. This country doesn't move of its own momentum. This country moves through individuals acting in a way that cause it to move in a direction. Strong individual leadership that understands that we as a nation were built on the concept of taking on big issues, reaching solutions that are bipartisan. And one other thought: every issue of any significance in this country that's going to affect most Americans, take Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, national defense, the American people will tolerate a complex and difficult solution that affects them personally if they believe the solution is fair. And fairness in our culture is defined by one thing: bipartisanship. And we're losing that, and we need to get it back. Thank you. I had the good fortune to teach, or be with, I didn't leave any thoughts that were worth remembering, Kristin's course, and it was great fun, great students.
Yeah, thank you so much for coming to my class. I think it was a wonderful experience for the students and for me as well. So the first question that I want to start with is about your role as chief negotiator of the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act of 2008. Or more colloquially known as the bank bailout of 2008. This act is widely credited with restoring stability and liquidity to the financial sector, unfreezing the markets for credit and capital, and lowering borrowing costs for households and businesses. This in turn helped restore confidence in the financial system and restart the economic growth in the United States, but also in the world. So if you could please share with us what it was like to lead those negotiations and basically save the global economy.
Well, thank you, Ed. That's very generous. But I agree with it. It's an interesting story. I was chairman of the ranking on the budget committee at the time. And we knew we had a crisis on our hands. And it's a long story, but Secretary Paulson had taken up a proposal to the House membership, and which was one page, and the House leadership, Democratic leadership, had given him back a proposal which was 435 pages. And that's sort of typical of a legislative body. And So they decided to set up a working group to negotiate, and it should have been led on the Senate side, on our side, by our banking committee members, but there was a fallout between the banking committee members within themselves as to their willingness to participate. So Mitch McConnell asked me to take over the responsibility, and I ended up being the only negotiator on the Republican side. That was on like a Wednesday that I ended up in that position. On Thursday, on Thursday, Kathy and I had gone down to a black tie dinner at the National Gallery, which I hate black tie, but Kathy puts up with a lot of chicken dinners. So I went, and it's about 9 o'clock at night, and I get a call from Senator McConnell. He says, "I need you on the Hill in 15 minutes. And I said, "Great." So I said, "Kathy, enjoy the rest of the evening. I'm heading up to the Hill." So I go into this room, S119, and in the room were about 7 people. Chris Dodd, who was head of the House Senate Banking Committee, Barney Frank, head of the House Banking Committee, Ken Conrad, who was chairman of the Budget Committee, Chuck Schumer, who was the senator from New York. He didn't hold any leadership positions at the time, and Spencer Backus, the minority member of the Banking Committee in the House, and myself. And we were just sitting there. We didn't know why we were there. And about 5 minutes later, Harry Reid and Mitch McConnell came in, the two of them, no staff, very unusual. And Harry Reid said, he was the majority leader at the time, he said, "In 5 minutes, Chairman Bernanke and Secretary Paulson are going to be here. Listen to what they say, and now we got to get to work." And they left. And about 5 minutes later, Chairman Bernanke came in with Secretary Paulson, maybe 1 staff each. I mean, there was nobody in the room, no staff, very unusual. And Chairman Bernanke says, there was no small talk. He didn't say how the Red Sox are doing or anything. He said, sat down, he said, "If you don't give Secretary Paulson what he needs, within 24 hours, 48 hours, the entire banking system of the United States will fail, and then the entire banking system of the world will fail." It was sobering, to say the least. From that moment on, Spencer Backus actually left the room because he said the House Republicans didn't want to participate. But from that moment on, there was no partisanship. We negotiated continually. Starting Thursday night, we set up our staffs, we set up how we were going to proceed. All Friday night, all Saturday. About halfway through Saturday, Secretary Paulson was in the room. Secretary Paulson and I were doing the negotiation with Republicans. Chris Dodd and Barney Frank and a bunch of other Democratic members were in the room. Secretary Paulson said, "If we don't have a deal by 12 o'clock on Sunday when the Asian markets open, it's game, set, match, and we can't stop it." And so we just worked. And I asked Secretary Paulson, I said, "How did you come to the number $700 billion, which is what he wanted, which at that time was a huge amount of money. I mean, since then, it's not so big." But he said, "Well, I was headed up here in the car, and we were going to ask for $300 billion. And I said to myself, no, I'm going to ask for $700 billion. I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I want to make it clear to the world that nobody can make a run on the American banks because they'll be taken on the American government." That was the fulcrum on which this whole thing was determined, and it was Secretary Paulson, who was so sophisticated in this area, having been a Goldman Sachs head and understanding world finance. He understood that was the key. Avoid a run on the American banking system. So we negotiated. We got to about, we've been going all day, all night. We got to Saturday night, Sunday morning. And we're sitting there, and we reached some sort of disagreement, and I walked with Rahm Emanuel, who went on to be President Obama's chief of staff and then became mayor of Chicago. And Rahm and I went over to meet Secretary Paulson in one of the rooms off of where we were negotiating. It was a closet. It was essentially a closet. And Secretary Paulson, this was probably 12 o'clock at night, maybe 11:45. Secretary Paulson started to have some sort of a reaction. It looked like a heart attack almost. And he said, I said, should we get the doctor? And he said, no doctors, no doctors. Turned out he was a Christian Scientist. I didn't know that. And he said, this happens when I've been exhausted. And of course, he hadn't slept for weeks. And it just, I'll know I'll get through it. He went to Dartmouth, by the way, as you all know, I'm sure. And so we walk out of the room, and Ron turns to me, who was representing Speaker Pelosi. He says, we got to get this deal done. We can't have the Secretary of Treasury dying in the middle of the deal. And so we went back, and we were down to one item, restitution. Myself, Barney Frank, and Rahm Emanuel. And Barney says, who was a good friend, I'd known him for years, ever since he'd been in the House. He says, I'm sorry, I can't agree. This is over. I'm done. We can't have an agreement. It's finished. I just can't do any more. And he was exhausted. Everybody was exhausted. It's after 12 o'clock at night on Saturday. And I look at Rahm and I said, Rahm, this can't be. This can't be. We can't have this happen. And he said, okay, wait a second. He gets Barney Frank up. They walk into the next room, which was the Speaker's office. I hadn't realized she was in the building. This is late at night on Saturday. About 10 minutes later, the Speaker comes out and says, okay, Judd, we'd made an offer early in the day, myself, well, Secretary Paulson, I carried the offer. We're going to do it the way you wanted to do it. This deal is closed. We're going to press right now. She walked down the hallway with Secretary Paulson. They held a press conference. It was done. Nobody knows, except myself, and I've mentioned it to people, nobody's ever covered the fact that basically it was Speaker Pelosi who closed the deal and really saved the banking system. As you may recall, just as an aside, I hate to go on too long in this.
No, this is good. This is a good story.
On Monday, we had to draft the bill all night, all day, Sunday, and on Monday they took the bill to the floor of the House. Well, by that time, the Republican leadership in the House had signed on. They'd sent Roy Blunt into the negotiations late on Saturday, a very talented guy. He'd reached an agreement. So the House leadership, both sides had signed on to this bill, $700 billion bailout. And what happens in legislative bodies sometimes is that when you get a really bad vote, you don't want to vote yes. Well, this was a bad vote for Republicans because it was spending $700 billion. It was a bad vote for Democrats because it looked at a bailout for bankers. So because the rank and file felt that the leadership of both parties had signed on, they figured they had the votes. So what happened was House people came in, they voted early, they voted no, and they left. And they wouldn't, so they couldn't be found by the leadership. And the bill went down on Monday morning, late Monday morning, and the stock market collapsed. Some of you may remember it. And we thought we were into the Depression. And so much, again, to Mitch McConnell and Harry Reid's credit, they called the Senate into session. And even though there were some technical reasons why the Senate should not have taken this bill up, tax reasons and the way taxes work in Congress, we passed it in the Senate with 79 votes, stabilized it, and then the House came back on Thursday and passed it. And that's how the bill passed. But honestly, when Bernanke said, if you don't do something in 48 hours, or you don't do what Paulson wants in 48 hours, the entire banking system in the United States will fail and the world on top of it, it was the most amazing, well, I don't know how to describe it, startling event of my political career outside of 9/11.
I knew that was going to be a good story. Thank you for sharing that. My next question is about some of the really serious issues that are confronting our nation, some of which are on a timeline. And here I'm talking about climate change and the environment. As Senator, you secured funding to purchase and protect over 300,000 acres of critical lands in New Hampshire, 300,000, yeah. Including around the Great Bay. So I'm wondering if there are areas concerning the environment, aside from setting aside critical lands, that represent potential areas of bipartisan legislation or compromise.
Well, but environmental protection is not a partisan issue unless it's pushed in that direction by people who are so strident that their goal is to win and destroy the opposition. And there are some activist groups in this country who are not constructive, who claim to be conservation groups. But it should always be bipartisan. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, and he was probably the most environmentally sensitive president ever. And climate change has to be addressed in a rational, thoughtful way. I'll take one issue, nuclear power. Nuclear power is probably the cleanest, most efficient way to get a massive amount of carbon out of our atmosphere and have the base load you need to run the country. You can put up all the windmills you want, you can put up all the solar you want, you're not going to produce enough base load to maintain an economy like ours. You've got to have some very significant base load that doesn't get impacted by climate. And nuclear power is an example of that. And for years, nuclear power has been vehemently opposed by some of the environmental movement. Now that's changing, and rightly so, but we need to be thoughtful enough about this so that we don't simply have knee-jerk reaction to how you address the issue. I mean, it's got to be addressed at all sorts of different levels. Also, you got to remember, our contribution to this is, we've been extremely constructive as a country in reducing our amount of pollution. And we're going to continue to be, absolutely. I mean, but you know, every electric car has to be supported by a base load that can support the electric car. And so, but some countries, I mean, China's adding a coal plant almost every week. India feels very strongly that they shouldn't have to reduce climate emissions because they're in a developing economy and they see us as having developed by having created all this carbon. So this is a world issue that has got lots of subtlety to it on how you resolve it. And you just can't be dogmatic about it, in my opinion.
Thank you. So one of your key themes today in your talk tonight and in my class was bipartisanship, and the need for bipartisanship at the beginning of discussions. Do you think time limits would
Term limits?
Term limits would be a way of helping some of that, fostering some bipartisanship?
You know, when I went to Congress, I was for term limits. Maybe I stayed there long enough so I wasn't.
Yeah.
But at the risk of saying something that might touch a nerve of some major staff people that are here from spent many years doing good things for us. I came to this conclusion. We already have a government where the elected officials do not have enough power to control, as I mentioned, the regulatory state. And it takes a long time to become a specialist in various functions of the government. It took me 12 years before I understood the budget well enough to be able to feel that I could stand up to the staff on the issue of how it worked, and to various departments as to when they sent me their budgets and whether it really made sense and they weren't gaming me. If you term limit members of Congress, then basically you're going to eliminate members of Congress who actually understand their specialty. I would take, for perfect example, a guy like Ted Kennedy or Daniel Inouye, who were there for years and years and years and did defense. Nobody snuck anything by those guys. They knew it inside and out. And if you eliminate them at the end of 12 years, basically you're taking out of the system the one elected group of people who can stand up to the unelected group of people. Because staff does not change, especially on the key committees. It just doesn't change. Republican staff's there forever, Democratic staff's there. They're all very constructive, hardworking, decent people, but they do have agendas. And so I just think the way you term limit someone is you vote them out of office. And if somebody's not doing the job, you vote them out. And granted, there are a lot of places in this country, well, the gerrymandered districts especially, where it's impossible, pretty hard to vote somebody out, but I just think it's better than term limits to take off the playing field the folks who can really can really understand very complex issues that you confront. Education, healthcare especially.
Thank you. So my final question before I open it up to the audience, is about the national debt. You spoke a little bit about this already, and your work on the National Commission of Fiscal Responsibility. Fiscal responsibility and reform, which resulted in a report with several recommendations, including raising taxes and cutting spending. In the end, the committee vote did not reach the required supermajority, and so the blueprint did not go to.
That's not the reason, but yeah.
Yeah. What are some lessons we can learn from this? And is there hope for fiscal responsibility?
Well, as I said to your class earlier, this issue of the deficit and how you address it really comes down to how you address the spending side of the ledger entitlements. It's always, and entitlements, which make up 60% of federal spending, are on autopilot. They aren't appropriated every year, they just happen. If you meet certain conditions, if you're over a certain age, you get a Medicare. If you're over a certain age and have a low income, you get Medicaid. If you're a veteran, you get veterans benefits. If you're a student, you have a right to a student loan. So there's no way to discipline these spending, it just expands. And this is a situation which can only be addressed in a bipartisan way. And I think it's one of those issues which you can't address legislatively, because the legislative process doesn't allow you to make the tough calls that have to be made. Now, the commission you refer to is called the Simpson-Bowles Commission, or the Bowles-Simpson Commission. And it was set up because Ken Conrad and Ken was chairman of the Budget Committee and I was ranking. We had come to the conclusion that we could not, through the legislative process, get the debt under control. And Ken was the Democratic leader on this issue. He coined the phrase, the debt is the threat. And so we decided to follow something called the Brack Commission formula. And the Brack Commission, after the end of the Cold War, we had hundreds of military bases and we couldn't close any of them, although many of them should have been closed because everybody had their defender in the House or the Senate. So they set up a Brack Commission, which was a commission of people who weren't actually members of Congress. They studied all the military bases in the country, and they came up with 4 different times, they came up with major reports which closed hundreds of military bases in the United States and outside. But the key to the Brack Commission was they would put 100 commissions into a closure bill, but you only got 1 vote. It was up or down, no amendments. You couldn't hide behind the amendment process. And all of them passed. And as a result, we right-sized the military. That's what you have to do. You have to have a commission made up of really thoughtful, responsible members, primarily of the Congress, with some outside participation appointed by the president, which is what this commission did, Simpson-Bowles. But our mistake was we didn't legislate it. So there was no requirement that the commission, which actually came up with a plan to stabilize the federal debt, addressed all the functions of the government, made Social Security solvent, didn't address health care, excuse me, because the Obamacare bill had just passed and the president didn't want to address that, didn't want to reopen it. But that commission reached an agreement where we reduced the rate of growth of the deficit, taking 75% from the spending side and 25% with new revenues. It was attacked from the left, it was attacked from the right, aggressively, because it did both. But the problem was we didn't legislate it, so it never got to the floor of the Senate. It could have been brought up if Harry Reid had wanted to bring it up. It had 11 positive votes, including very conservative members, very liberal members. But it was never brought up. That type of commission should be set up again, and it should be legislated with an up or down vote. The reason you don't allow amendments is because in legislatures, what happens is, if there's a bill on the floor and you want to vote against it, but you don't want to vote against it the way it's standing, you offer an amendment you know is going to be defeated. Then when your amendment gets defeated, you can vote against the bill. So you don't allow amendments because the games are outrageous. There is actually a group in the House called the Problem Solving Caucus, which has proposed this. And I wish somebody would listen to it.
So now I'd like to open up questions to the audience. There is a mic, I understand, that is coming around. So if you would like to ask a question, just wait for the mic. So maybe just raise your hand if you have a question. So there's questions in the front.
Thank you. My question concerns polarization specifically.
What issue?
Polarization.
Yes.
I'm from Canada. We see polarization in our country as well, coming close to the extremes that you see in the United States.
It's very cold around the polar part of Canada.
Yeah. This is very, very true. But the big question I have for the United States at the moment is what would be the starting point to address the issues we see in polarization today? I know there's no one silver bullet solution, but where can the United States start to correct this very grave issue?
Well, I think the only way you can address it is through leaders. Having leaders who can take on the complex issues and are willing to stand up to the vitriol that it dominates and the hate that dominates the social media venue. And as I mentioned, the virulent populism. You've got to have leaders who are strong enough to do that. Right now, we're a little short on that. There's no structural way to correct it, I don't think. I don't think you can end gerrymandering because it's under our federal system, states have the right to draw their districts, and under our political system, there's a natural tendency to want to protect your district. But you can put an end to forces who are not there to govern, but are there to shout, being the dominant force in the room. And you do that through strong leaders. I always used to say, leadership doesn't involve stepping on the toes of your opponent. It involves stepping on the toes of your people to get something done. And right now we're a little deficit in leadership.
There's a question in the back, and then a question
Right behind you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Senator. My question is quite
Could you stand up?
Yeah.
Sorry.
My question is sort of in the same line as to where we can get this leadership from. I am concerned that a lot of the Congress people in Congress who tend to reach across the aisle are currently endangered. They tend to be Southern Democrats, they tend to be California Republicans like Young Kim, Michelle Steele, and these people are getting voted out at alarming rates. So where is this leadership? Where are these people willing to cross the aisle going to come from in the American political system?
In the American system, it's got to come from the parties and somebody in the parties who dominates the party in a way that gives it leadership. And there's no other way around it. And they don't necessarily have to be the leader of the party, they just have to be the voice that's listened to the most as a leader. And right now we're short on that, very obviously. We do have dominant voices in our party right now, but they're not party dominant voices, in my opinion, that are directed towards leading the country towards constructive solutions. In fact, they're dividers rather than uniters. And you need uniters. But our system historically has produced those people. And I'm sure we will. At some point, the American people just get very frustrated with people who are purpose is to divide and not govern rather than unite. I mean, the populist movement is always going to be there, but it usually gets pushed to the side by folks who really would like to move on with a country that works well. And so leaders who come up with ideas and have the capacity, the charisma to communicate those ideas evolve. And I think you're starting to see a few in our party come in that direction. Whether they'll be able to get past Mr. Trump, I don't know. But I think we're seeing some folks like that coming up. And the Democratic Party has some really good people too. And my view is that maybe, hopefully in this round, we'll see new faces on both sides of the aisle running for president. And I think there's a reasonable chance of that.
There's a question in the front here. Can you raise your hand so he knows? Yeah.
This is coming from staff. There's got to be a warning sign on this one.
Senator, in 2013, then Senate Leader Harry Byrd eliminated the filibuster for non-Supreme Court judicial nominations. And then when the Republicans regained power, then Leader Mitch McConnell eliminated the filibuster for Supreme Court nominations. Since then, there's been efforts to eliminate blue slips, which allow veto of judges in a particular state by those representatives, as well as filibusters for legislation itself. In your presentation, you drew a contrast between the Senate as a cooling saucer, a deliberative body, and the House. Do you feel that there's a danger with the elimination of such things as the filibuster and the blue slip that the Senate will become more like the House?
It would become exactly like the House if the filibuster were eliminated for policy purposes, as you know. And I like that question. Thank you for giving it to me. Yeah, I don't have any problem eliminating the filibuster for the calendar that involves appointing individuals, court, and I think the president's cabinet and members of the president's administration. I have no problem there. I would have a huge problem, and it would fundamentally undermine our form of government if it were eliminated on the issues of policy. And why is that? Because the Senate, under our system, has evolved into the place where the minority is protected. It's the only place in our government where the minority is protected. The president, obviously, is a person of one. The House, as you know, is run as a total autocracy. The minority has no rights at all in the House. The Senate, the minority has to be listened to, because if you can't get 60 votes, you can't pass anything. And usually there's not 60 votes in the Senate to pass things from one party having 60 votes. And this is critical to our system, in my opinion, because if you don't have a minority voice that has some substance and capacity to impact the process, you don't have a Madisonian form of government. You have a parliamentary form of government. And parliamentary governments swing wildly left and right, back and forth, and they govern inefficiently in that manner. We govern inefficiently because we're fairly inert, but they go too far left, they go too far right. We do not want a parliamentary system. And if you eliminate the filibuster on the policy side, you get a parliamentary system, if you get both houses and the presidency in the same party.
Other questions? Yes.
Thank you. Keeping with the theme here of the questions, I was a little disappointed in your term limit answer. I don't think you have to do 2 terms for the Senate. You could go with 3 or 4. I think what we want to do is stop people running into their 80s and even 90s now serving in the Senate. But money in politics is sort of another way to change this a little bit. Where do you stand on that? Do you believe in any controls over campaign finance spending? What kind, if any? Do you think there's nothing we can do and you believe in the free market, which is fine? Or do you believe there's got to be some rules and maybe we can have better rules?
Transparency. The Supreme Court's made it very clear, and I think they're probably correct constitutionally, that freedom of speech requires the capacity to deliver your speech, and that requires money. But we have very little transparency now. And that, quite honestly, is a result of Feingold-McCain, or McCain-Feingold. That bill was a disaster. It created all this dark money. And so I think we've got to figure out a way to force the dark money out of the shadows and make it very clear who gets what money and who contributed to giving such money. And it seems to me we should be able to do that. But I don't think you can limit the amount of money.
One final question from the audience.
I answered every question. That's unusual.
You talk a lot about the collapse of the different political parties.
Could you stand up? I should recall your name from earlier.
Absolutely. You talk a lot about the collapse of the political parties. As a Republican, what would you say that the Republican Party needs to do in order to build consensus within the party itself to begin?
Nominate someone other than Donald Trump. We're going through a position where the party has become a cult to a large degree, and that's a big mistake. So our party has to become more tolerant, and it has to nominate people who understand that you can be ideological without being a divider. And there's too much emphasis on division within our party right now, within the party, but also as a party focused on division. And I would say the same thing for the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democratic Party has an even bigger problem than we have, in my humble opinion. It's not humble, my opinion. We have an individual problem and a cult that's be built around them and the populism that is driving it. The Democratic Party has a huge structural problem with their move to the progressive side of the ledger, which is essentially socialism, if you're going to be honest about it, because that's not mainstream American thought. America plays between the 40-yard line on both sides. Most Americans are either center left or they're center right. There are very few people who are out here on the hard left or the hard right, but the Democratic Party has moved hard left, and they need to get back from that. And you listen to the folks in the Senate, Democratic senators, they understand this. But once again, the loud voices are dominating, in my opinion, which is, but this too will pass, by the way. We are such an inherently resilient nation, and our system is inherently resilient, that I have no question but that this too will pass. And I am sure also that we'll get under control our biggest problem, which is our fiscal issues. And hopefully we'll work something out with China that doesn't involve military conflict. But if you're going to pick a nation to be in and a government to be under, this is the one you want. Thank you very much.
So I have one last question as the moderator, and I just have a closing remark. So we still have 3 minutes. I want to personally thank you for your years of public service. You've worked as a governor, a U.S. House representative, and a U.S. senator. We have several students in the audience who are looking to enter public service. What advice can you give these students, and which job did you like best?
Well, my advice is do what you enjoy doing. There is no single pathway into elective office. People elect people they have confidence in, they think they like, and they meet their criteria for whatever they want in the way of governance. And people come, in the Senate, people came from all walks of life. As I was saying to your class, one of my closest friends was a shoe salesman. I mean, it's just, they come from all over the place. So your pathway is it's really tied to your success in whatever you think you want to do. And then if you take that success and maybe move it into public office, that's it. Which job did I like the most? Well, I was governor during what we call the Gregg Depression. When 5 of my 7 largest banks failed, both public utilities failed. That's the first time that happened in history in any state. Housing prices dropped 30 to 40%. My state revenues dropped every month. It was a really tough time. And I always say that I used to be asked when I was in the Senate by folks who were thinking of leaving the Senate and running for governor, make sure your revenues are going up. But it's a fascinating job because the 2 jobs are totally different. When you're governor, for every action, there's a reaction. You call on somebody's not doing, fixing an intersection, you call in your department and say, why isn't that intersection fixed? Call them in at 5 o'clock at night. Did you fix the intersection? And things get done. The Senate, on the other hand, is like, I was mentioning to your class, it's like a bowl of Jell-O. Put your hand in it, take it out. It's the same thing as when you started. And it does that. You can do that for like 6 months, 8 months, a year, 2 years. It takes a long time to legislate, but it's fascinating. The issues in the Senate are fascinating issues. Being governor, you get things done. In the Senate, you address a lot of fascinating issues. So I'd say I enjoyed them both. I'd have to ask Kathy, which you enjoyed both?
Well, I think the Great Depression was
She had problems with the Great Depression.
come home at night and he'd be on Channel 9 News. And he'd say, Dartmouth, oh my gosh, I mean, you just look so sad. He said, well, there's nothing happy to talk about.
Well, on behalf of Rocky, I want to thank you, Senator Gregg, for coming and speaking with us today and for speaking with my class today. Our next event is the Path to the Presidency with Marianne Williamson on Tuesday, October 3rd at 5 p.m. here in Hinman Forum. So good night, all. Thank you for coming.